Kia ora and welcome back. Graham Smith from ALEC here again. So this is part 2 of our presentation on mapping, knowing the demands of your learner using the learning progressions. Alright, so here's how it works. Let's have a look together. You need to use the learning progressions for adult literacy and numeracy to assess the literacy and numeracy demands of your training. Okay, so let's have a quick look at how it works, and I'll just try and give you the big picture first, and then from there we'll get down to the specifics. So for each progression, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's something for numeracy or something for literacy, we have the level of difficulty spread out over 6 steps, and down towards step 1 or 2 we've got the easier side of things, and up towards step 5 and 6 we've got the harder end of things where there's more complexity and difficulty. So one of the things that you're trying to do here is to work out the demands of your training course, and this relates to our task 3. So for example, if you are working in a trade or doing vocational training where there's any kind of technical or specialized language involved, chances are that's going to be around step 5 or step 6. And just so you can see how this works together with the other parts of the course, once you get to task 4, looking at diagnostic assessment, you might work out that your learner might be quite low. They might be a step 2 or a step 3. So what that tells you then is the difference between the demands of the course, or what they ought to be able to do, versus what they can actually do. And once you know those two things, where they should be and where they're at now, then you can work out what you actually need to do to move them forward. And that's when you can plan and deliver your embedded literacy and numeracy learning, and that relates to task 5. So once you know that, hopefully you can move them along like that. Once you've moved them, task 6, you need to assess or measure their progress for literacy and numeracy. So that's how these next couple of assessment tasks work together. This is also our process for embedding literacy and numeracy. Basically, if you want to boil it down to something very, very simple and easy to remember, it's a test, teach, test process. Okay, so we call this best guess, don't stress, when we use the learning progressions to work out the actual step that your learner is at with regards to a particular progression. So let's have a look at the best guess process in a bit more detail. Okay, if you have a look on the screen here, I've got a blank grid. This is a strand chart for the make sense of number to solve problems strand. So you can see the strand goes long ways across the screen, and inside each strand there is a number of progressions, and here we've got 6 number progressions. And if I start on the left hand side there, we've got additive strategies, multiplicative strategies, proportional reasoning, and then number sequence, place value, and number facts. So each of those is a progression inside the strand. So we've got the make sense of number strand, and we've got 6 progressions here, and those little boxes inside the progressions going down from 1 to 6, each one of those boxes is a step, and when we plot our learner onto those steps and progressions, that's the mapping part. So here, for example, it's my imaginary course. I've mapped it for additive strategies at step 5. And the way I do that is I open up the learning progressions for adult numeracy. In this case, I look at the strand for make sense of number, and inside each of those little boxes is a description. I look at the description and I make a judgment. Now there is some subjectivity involved here, but you'll find the more you do this, the easier it will become, and it's not totally subjective. If you do this with your colleagues, you'll find that very quickly you'll come to some quite robust judgments about where your course or particular tasks should be mapped. So I'm not going to get into all the details of the particular descriptions of the steps here. For our purposes right now, it's enough to say I've looked at the description for step 5. I might have also looked either side, perhaps at step 4 and step 6, and made my decision that my course or my task that I'm looking at fits at step 5. And then I might move across and look at multiplicative strategies, which is to do with times tables and divisions and how you work those out, and I might make a similar decision and say, well, I think in this case it's about a step 4. And then I might also do a similar thing around proportional reasoning and say, well, I think that's a step 5. Now, just with this particular strand, the make sense of number strand, there's a shortcut. If you know on the strategy side, that's these first 3 columns, that the highest step is a 5, then on the knowledge side of things, which is on the right hand side there, you can map everything by default at the step below the highest step on the other side. So it sounds more complicated than it actually is, but I've mapped additive and proportional reasoning at step 5. That means the knowledge that someone needs to do those things is automatically at step 4. If my highest strategy progression was, say, step 6, then the knowledge required to do that strategy would be step 5 across those other 3. So that's just a little shortcut and a tip. It only works with the make sense of number strand, but it's one way you can speed up this whole process. So that's it in a nutshell, and that's as far as we go for task 3. But just to help make the connections for you, once you've analysed the task demands, or it might be a text demands, or the demands of your training in terms of these learning progressions, once you've mapped them, then you can start mapping your learners. And it's the same process. You have a look at the descriptions in those steps, and you just make a judgment as to where you think your learners are at. Now, that judgment might be informed by other information. For example, if you have diagnostic information from your own assessments or from the TEC's assessment tool, that's going to help you make these judgments and decisions. But here you can see I've mapped my task at step 5, I've mapped my learner at step 3, and I can also go across the rest of the progressions and work out roughly what the difference is for a particular strand, talking about where my learner is at versus where they need to be in terms of the course expectations and so on. So it's the gap between those two which is the critical thing here. And that gap where the learner's ability starts to impact on the task demands, that's where you should be focusing your embedded training. So let's have a look at the same thing for reading. This is my read with understanding strand, and you can see there's 5 different progressions here. I've got decoding, vocabulary, language and text, comprehension, and reading critically. Now, when it comes to the literacy strands, I always start with vocabulary. I think it's the easiest one to get your head around. Go ahead and map the vocabulary for your course. Now, if it's a trade or vocational training of some kind, if there's any kind of specialized language, jargon, technical words and terms, straight away if you look at those descriptions in step 4.5 where it talks about specialized words, you're going to be mapping here at least step 4.5. If it's a course where there's a lot of technical words, then it's going to be right down at step 6. If you're doing just very general training where it doesn't have any academic content or any specialized words, then you're probably down at about step 3. But I think most of our NCALNE candidates are working at NZQA level 1 and 2, and that usually means there's some kind of technical language, some kind of specialized language or jargon, often unit standards, which means you're at least a step 4.5. So that's where I start. I always start with vocabulary. I have a look at step 4.5, look at the description, and then I might push it down to step 6 and see whether it sits there comfortably. If it doesn't, I might keep it at step 4.5. Sometimes I have a look at step 3 and see whether it sits there or not. Then I move across to decoding. Now decoding, don't forget, decoding is not comprehension. Decoding is just, can they read it out loud to you? Can they look at the word on the page and read it out loud? That's all decoding is. Language and text, same process. Comprehension, same process. Reading critically, same process. And then you can go through and do the same thing. Once you've mapped those task and text demands, you can go through and map your learner's ability. And you might be able to do this for particular learners in your group that are struggling. If your learners are all roughly the same, you might be able to map them as a group. It's up to you, whatever purpose you need this for. And once again, it's the gap between where your learners are at versus the demands of your training. And it's that gap that you've got to try and bridge, and that's when you use your embedded literacy and numeracy interventions to try and move them, for example in this case, say from step 3 down to that step 4 or step 4, 5, and hopefully ultimately down to step 6 if that's where they need to go. So you need to have a go at doing this in a couple of different ways. You need to look at your course as a whole and try and map the literacy and numeracy demands, the broad brushstrokes of the literacy and numeracy demands of your whole course. And you need to have a go at a couple of very specific tasks or texts and map those. And in between this kind of broad brushstroke mapping and very specific mapping of particular examples, you should get a pretty good picture of the literacy and numeracy demands of your training. And then once you add to that your learner's ability, you start to get a picture of where you need to be embedding. And it's that gap between the demands and the learner's ability that's the critical zone. Okay, that's where you pitch your embedded training interventions at, or perhaps one step above that if you think you can push them. For the purposes of our assessment task, you need to do this mapping using our template, which you can download off our website, and you also need to write up what the mapping actually means, and there's some prompts and starters to get you going there. You can see here on the screen. This is the kind of these are the kind of sentences that you need to write as you do your analysis, and then tell us what it actually means. You're justifying your decisions in terms of when you're mapping something at step 4 or 3 or 5 or 6 and so on. You're just trying to justify to us why you made that decision. The easiest way to do that is to give us examples. Okay, so that's how you use the learning progressions. We're really just scratching the surface there, I guess, but hopefully you get the idea. The mistake that most people make is that they tend to overthink and overcomplicate this. For our purposes, for the NCALNE qualification, it's a simple process. It's best guess, don't stress. You just have a go. It's your best guess. We're not talking about an overly scientific, time-consuming process here. Have a go. If you get stuck, email us through a draft of what you're working on and we'll have a look and help you work it through. That's great. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.